Good afternoon. This is Dyke Hendrcikson, and this is the podcast Life Along the Merrimack. Each week we get together and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. And I have a number of slides which I show, which kind of bring out the themes I'm trying to get at for a given day. One of the items that's happening right now in the news is that a number of congressional representatives from the North Shore and from New Hampshire are trying to change some of the rules for getting more money to clean up our sewage treatment plants. Right now, the river is hampered by the fact that during heavy rains, the rainwater is sent into the sewage treatment plants in large cities like Haverhill, Lowell, Merrimack, Lawrence, and Manchester. So you get a lot of rainwater, you got a lot of effluent, which is sewage, and they can't take it all. And so the operators let the whole amount of water go into the river. And of course, when you have sewage along getting into the river, it's a bad thing. 2 years ago, it was estimated 800 million gallons of this discharge got into the river. So that's a bad thing. Many communities need money to improve their plants so they don't put so much sewage in the river. And they include Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, and Manchester, New Hampshire actually just signed a very large package, 20-year program to improve their sewage treatment system. It's $232 million with a lot of federal money, but that's what I think everyone's looking for. Come on, this is going to take money. But anyway, the individuals, the congressional representatives, including Lori Trahan, Seth Moulton, Chris Pappas of New Hampshire, and Annie Custer of New Hampshire, are trying to change the rules a little bit. Right now, low-cost loans for improving sewage treatment plants are given to states by their population. Like Florida, for instance, has quite a high population, so they get an enormous amount of money. But New England states, such as Massachusetts and New Hampshire, we don't have the population, but we have much more serious sewage conditions because our plants are much older. Florida communities have built in the last 10 or 20 years. Some of our plants go back 50 or 70 years, and they need to be updated and they need to be expanded. So I want to say that Lori Trahan has been a good trooper on that one. She represents the Lowell area, and I'll be talking about more contributors later, but I just wanted to mention that. Here's our beautiful river. It's quite narrow, it's quite shallow. Beyond it is the marsh, and the marsh is very valuable. It helps with the aquatic life, it helps with birds, it helps with crustaceans. And so I think everybody on the North Shore is hoping that we can do better and have a cleaner river. This is the way the Merrimack River looks on a map. It comes from central New Hampshire, from the Winnipesaukee Lake region, and comes through Concord, Manchester, Nashua. And of course, the Massachusetts cities include Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, and right at the top of the, near the ocean is Newburyport. But you get an idea of how far it comes down. It's about 117 miles. Going back over history as we do, we talk about the health, but also the history. Newburyport was a great shipbuilding community, the 9th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Here's a wonderful artistic rendering from about 1850, done by Richard Jones here in Newburyport. He is the city clerk, but obviously a very talented artist. Here is one of a wonderful slide of one of the last tall ships that was built in Newburyport. And you can see how many people gathered. It was a big day. And it was also a time when you recognized how many jobs that this provided, not just for the people who would sail with the vessel, but people who made cord, people who made sail, people who did woodworking or ironmongering, hotels in the area, restaurants in the area. it was almost a full economy, I must say. And so up until about 1893, Newburyport was such a leading builder. After that period of time, many of the boats were made of iron or steel. They were steamers, and because the river mouth is so shallow, 12 to 16 feet draw at low tide, you could get a large ship like the Somington out into the ocean, but it really couldn't come back because when it was loaded with cargo, it was too heavy and just couldn't make it through. But here's a picture that can remind us of the old days of shipbuilding and the excitement of getting the ship into the water. Pawtucket Falls in Lowell is a basic element of that community for many years. It was a situation where if you had as strong falls as this one, you could link it up with machinery, with the Industrial Revolution and hydropower, and you could create mills. Here is on the North Shore, the Spigot River in Lawrence. This is from the late 19th century, earlier 20th century. You can see that the railroad has arrived, but you can also see many smokestacks in the distance. And so it was an enormous amount of mills in this community. As I've always thought as well, there must have been a huge brick building community, because if you've been past Lawrence or Lowell or Haverhill, you've seen the enormous brick buildings. And so I'm thinking, in addition to shipbuilding and textile making, there must have been a lot of bricks being created. Here was a mill clock from Lawrence. It was once called the second largest in the world, next to Big Ben of London. And you can see some of the elements that were here in Lawrence. It was helpful in the 18th century, 19th, to have a large clock, because not every mill worker had a watch. In fact, most of them probably didn't. They didn't make too much money. They were trying to put food on the table and improve their houses and lots and whatever. So it's helpful to have a large clock, and this is one of the largest ones in the United States. This is a very dynamic photo of the Merrimack River. I might mention that I have just completed a book titled Merrimack, the Resilient River. And that's, my interest, of course, is on the water. And I wrote 2 books before that, Nautical Newburyport, and then New England Coast Guard Heroes. And so this is an example of my 3rd book, Merrimack, the Resilient River. But Merrimack, New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, of course, was an enormous operation run by the Ameskeag Company. It dominated the community. But in this case, in 1936, this was a tremendous flood. And I would say the flood dominated the community that day. Here's another wonderful shot of the Merrimack River. So picturesque. And we had talked about how shallow it is. And you can see a sandbar there. And for mariners who have not come to Newburyport, and this goes back 100 years, or it goes back, 100 hours, some mariners do not know that we have a sandbar. And it makes the water much shallower and much harder to get through. Now, we have a harbor master, and he's very good. But if you don't know that there's a shallow sandbar, you may get stuck on it. Then the tide goes out, you're there for a good amount of time. But you can see a number of these vessels are heading for the North Jetty here, trying to get around this. But I think this is very representative of what the opening looks like. Coast Guard's vessels are often seen in the Merrimack River. This is in Newburyport, and there is a Newburyport Coast Guard station here, of course, and that's in the background. You can see a little of the brick there. They house about 26 coasties. The coasties do not stay overnight. It's not a dorm. They have their apartments or houses in the community. But of course, if there's, a storm or some great natural event going on, they can go down, they can stay over. But there's a 47-foot boat on the right here. You can see the 47. outlined, and that is the workhorse of the North Shore of Massachusetts. And believe it or not, if it's in hard weather and it overturns, it will come back up and keep running. And I was wondering about that, and I asked the captain, you know, how do we know that your vessel is actually gonna pop up and keep running? And he said, I took a cadet out once, it was on the West Coast, and he hit a huge wave broadside, and we did go over. And so, of course, I was thrilled to hear there's a live anecdote to go with this. And he said, no one was injured, everyone was strapped in, we knew it could happen. But he said, it was the quietest trip I've ever had back to the beach, because this cadet was so mortified that he had rolled the vessel. But, you know, I just said that, you know, it'll be okay. You'll take some more courses and you'll pass it eventually. But the Coast Guard, the birthplace of the Coast Guard is in Newburyport, 1790. So for that reason, the Coast Guard is a familiar and quite beloved site here. The Merrimack River is a fine place to keep a boat. We frequently talk about the challenges of pollution or CSOs, coming down the river, but it's still a wonderful spot to keep a boat. This is in Amesbury. Across the way is the Maudsley State Park, and it's just a wonderful asset to the North Shore. You can see Maudsley State Park, a little more of it here. It's about 450 acres. And they don't have any, in the old days, a century or so ago, they had, you know, boat ramps there, and the wealthy people who did inhabit the Maudsley mansions could get into the water. But in recent years, the wealthy have left. They sold these much acreage and much raw acreage to the state. There are no boating facilities there, but it's a wonderful place to go and watch. Haverhill is one community that's making a comeback. It could be said that Haverhill, Lowell, Lawrence, and Manchester are all trying to change their economic propositions. Of course, starting in the 1820s with Lowell, the textile mills were built, and there are many jobs offered for more than a century. That faded in the 40s and 50s, and so some of these communities have had to rebuild. And you can see that Haverhill has some new construction on the right, new construction down the way. One of the large building is used in part by UMass Lowell, and another building straight down the middle there is a new apartment complex. So Haverhill is making a comeback and using the river as one of its leading assets. Lowell, of course, has made a good comeback. They also benefited from a federal park that was funded there in 1978. The National Park Service in Lowell built a huge historical remembrance of the mill days. If you haven't been over there, it's a great thing. You should try it. Now, right now, it's closed by the COVID, but as part of the Park Service's offerings in the summer, they give rides in this vessel. It shows you the different canals, the different rivers. The captains of industry back in, as I say, the Lowell piece started in about 1823. Lawrence was incorporated in about 1847. But in that period of time, many canals were built and many ways to hold the water were created. So these boat trips are, you know, very good chances for people to learn more about the river. The Merrimack River, of course, starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. We mentioned that. And this part of it looks like it must have looked 200 or 300 years ago. It's just beautiful. People go down the river in kayaks. I think you might remember last August, about 15 to 20 river activists, actually. Some of them were elected officials, some of them were educators or Chamber of Commerce types, and they took the whole trip, 117 miles. down the Merrimack River. This is what it looked like when they started. Here is a pretty spot where the Nashua meets the Merrimack, and several rivers. I think there are 8 different tributaries that put into the Merrimack River. But here's a spot in Nashua, and I didn't know where it was. A lot of these places I take photos of, there's no marking. So I'm walking through a senior citizens area. They probably think I'm going to steal a silverware or something, but I wasn't. So I said, where? And the map shows that the river, Nashua River, meets the Merrimack here, and the guy gets off his old rocking chair and says, well, walk down there about 200 yards and you'll see it. And here it is. This is where the Nashua River meets the Merrimack. We mentioned that there are many areas in the community that still have dams and still generate power. This is in Manchester. You can see the huge amount of water coming over there, and much of it is held back to when either the mills or the electrical company needs it. Now, there are dozens of electric companies that still generate power from the Merrimack River. Not everyone knows that, but you can see some of the wires and the apparatus to the left. The Merrimack is still very powerful, providing power, and it is essential also for providing drinking water. More than 500,000 people in the Merrimack Valley still get their drinking water from the Merrimack. Now, we have alluded to the fact that the river gets dirty from time to time, but there's obviously modern science has seen to it that the river gets clean. But that being said, if you have 500,000 people getting the water from the river, it's really important for the river to be as clean as it can, and for as much financial resources going into cleaning the river as possible. And I would add that some communities, Newburyport is one that gets its water from the artichoke. But Lawrence and North Andover, Manchester is thinking about getting some water there. There are numerous communities that still get their drinking water there. And so that's why, another reason why we want to keep the river clean. This is Lowell. What a remarkable sight, I think, to see how much building has gone into it, how much cement. They calibrate how much water they want to use on a given day. They can get a lot of water, they can get a little water. The structure on the right is a UMass Lowell dorm, and there's stores beneath it. So UMass Lowell actually is perched right upon the river. It's very beautiful over there. And they're living with history, actually, because a lot of history occurred in Lowell. And those in Lowell, do enjoy the river. This is a shot. You have some fishermen there. You have a jogger. There are a couple mothers walking babies. And so many people do use the river, from Lowell to Newburyport up to Manchester, New Hampshire, that it really is incumbent upon us to try to keep it as clean as it can be. Here's the photo from Lowell. Many of their buildings still stand. And as I say, one of my unrequited research areas is to do a little study in the brick building industry, because there's so many bricks put together in the 19th century. It just intrigues me, not just here, but I've done books or articles in Lewiston, Maine, and Biddeford, Maine. If you've ever been up there, and in Manchester, there were a lot of bricks built, and a lot of large buildings still are standing. So that could be my next project, bricks. Manchester has done a good job in turning itself around from a mill town into a modern metropolis, really. You can see some mill buildings there on the right. They're used for now. They've repurposed them. Some of them are colleges, some are medical centers, some are restaurants. So they've done a good job, but they've also brought a lot of industry to the downtown. And you can see large hotels, big banks. I think Manchester is known for a community that has turned itself around, has left the mill days in the past and is doing quite well in the modern era. We mentioned this, and I want to mention it again because last summer of 2019, a group left Franklin, New Hampshire, and came all the way down the river. Now, it took them 4 days. They slept over a couple nights, maybe on the beach, maybe on in an armory or something, but really they were very vibrant, very motivated. And so Jim Kelcourse, he's a state rep from this part, from Newburyport, Amesbury, and Salisbury, is in the lead. And I think Lane Glenn is to the right. He's the president of Northern Essex Community College. So here are two guys taking the whitewater during this event, which was called the Voyagers. And they had press conferences every day, and they talked to many people on the North Shore, and they were saying, we're doing this to bring attention to the river. It's such a valuable commodity, and we have to do what we can to keep it clean and thriving. And here are the Voyagers again. They're going through Lawrence and near Lawrence and Lowell. This seems to be a quieter moment, but you can see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, about 12 folks are there at the time. I would say 20 did the whole Voyagers trip, not every day though, but I think 12 to 14 did the whole trip. And when you think about it, you're paddling all day long. Frequently you have to take the kayak out of the water and portage. Portage means to take it, you might walk a quarter of a mile and then put it in some other part of the river. And so there was a lot to it. You've got to get your food. You've got to have press conferences. I mean, this was no small endeavor. And in my book, Merrimack, the Resilient River, I have numerous pictures of these people because it was really a remarkable effort they did, very colorful, and a lot of high visibility people in the area were part of it. Here is one of the things we like to look at, I think. This is a Newburyport Harbor. This was at the end of the run of the Voyagers. And if you've been to Newburyport, I think it's so much has improved over the last 15 or 20 years that it's just a wonderful thing that there's close to 1,500 boats that are now registered there, another 500 on the left, which would be Salisbury and Amesbury. And many vessels are launched at Cashman Park. It's the busiest state launching area in Massachusetts. So all of this has come because the water got clean. Up until about 1970, there was no environmental movement. There was very little legislation to clean rivers. But President Nixon, believe it or not, approved the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And in 1972, Senator Ed Muskie from Maine and others were able to pass the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act of 1972 provided billions of dollars to places like Newburyport, Haverhill, Lowell, Lawrence, Manchester, and rivers started getting cleaner. And if you talk to older people, my tennis partner, Dick Canepa, grew up in the 50s. He said the river was so dirty, your parents would not let you go near it. Now, 50 years later, and we are at the 50-year mark from the EPA, it's a situation where the river's clean and it's a great recreational area. There aren't as many fishermen around as there used to be. Maybe there's a dozen there in Newburyport this year, but here's some of their gear. They still go out. There are, challenges. There's not as many fish in the river, to be sure. And the lobsters are trekking north, I hate to say. Rhode Island and Long Island have lost their lobsters, and they're coming through Massachusetts and going to Maine because the water is getting warmer and they're going to cooler water. But still, we have our fishermen and we have lobstermen, and Newburyport is still a site for that. We talked about this momentarily ago. Ed Muskie was a major sponsor of the Clean Water Act of 1972. He actually ran for president at that time. He dropped out. He and he then served other high posts. But Muskie from Maine was certainly, he grew up on in Rumford, Maine, on the Androscoggin River, which was very polluted. I used to live in Maine, so I can say that with authority. And he really was a powerful Democratic senator in 1972. He got that great bill passed, the Clean Water Act. Here he is testifying in the early 70s. His wife, Jane, is to the left, and he had 33 different hearings throughout different states and different cities so he can get all the facts together. And when he had all his facts, he was successful. Paul Tsongas is a great friend to the Merrimack Valley, of course. He was a senator from Lowell, and although he wasn't instrumentally as powerful as Muskie when it came to clean water, he was a very great champion of Lowell, of the Merrimack Valley, and he was in that era of people who tried to get cleaner water. Here's a wonderful shot of Paul Tsongas and his wife, Nikki. Of course, much younger than she went on to, he passed away, I think, 95, and she went on to take his, she ran for Congress after that and served for more than a decade. So this is, you know, a cute moment for the family, and he'll always be remembered. And Paul Tsongas died in 1997. Here is his gravesite adjacent to the Merrimack. I think anyone who knew him, and I had met him several times, he was a wonderful guy. He was energetic. He did everything he could for the North Shore, everything he could for the Merrimack River. And of course, he was helpful in the rebirth of Lowell. The convention center was built there. You know, before the COVID, there were many athletic events there, concerts, just a terrific thing. So he was one of the great people of the era. The Whittier Bridge is one of the largest institutional elements, if you will. This $200 million project was built half a dozen years ago. It's an enormous investment, but I think we all know that it's important to have good transportation from, say, southern New Hampshire to go to northern New Hampshire, such as the North Shore of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, and the Maritimes. So this is one of the largest occurrences that happened in the last decade on the river. State Senator Diana DiZoglio is a real advocate of the river. She's done great work, and she was one of the ones who went on the Voyager trip. I have her in another photo in my book. She's in a tandem kayak with State Rep Jim Kelcourse. But she has done a terrific job, and she was able to get a state bill passed, which created the Merrimack River District Commission. And so they're working hard to find solutions to have a cleaner river, because remember, 500,000 people get their water from the river. And here's some old hands. It's a situation where I just fell upon this photo somehow. Richard Nixon, he turned out to be a rogue at Watergate, but in 1970, he did approve the Environmental Protection Agency. Senator Hubert Humphrey was a great liberal, and of course, we said that Ed Muskie was responsible for the Clean Water Act of 1972. I've got to say, Nixon vetoed the Clean Water Act in 1972. After helping the EPA come alive, he vetoed this Clean Water Act of 72. But there were some lively Democrats around, and his veto was overrun. I mean, his veto was not sustained, and so the legislation passed over the veto. So those are some of the things that I wanted to talk about today. I'm talking to the Chamber of Commerce in the Newburyport area in a couple weeks, and these are some of the things I will be talking about. I love this photo. Actually, I love everything about the river. I'm glad you're here to join us every once in a while, and we'll have more photos and more interviews in the future. Thank you for joining us. This is Joppa Radio 96.3. We're also on Channel 9, and we talk about the health and history of the Merrimack River. Thank you for being with us.